Welcome to Convo Heals, the transformative mental health podcast.
We're three remarkable women from diverse backgrounds.
Join forces to harness the incredible healing power of conversation.
Each season, we embark on a journey
of exploration, empathy, and shared experiences
to illuminate the profound impact that thoughtful dialogue can have on our lives.
It's the Convo Heals podcast. Thank you so much for being here with us for the conversation that's always ongoing. I'm Dr. Erika.
I'm Dr. Brandi.
And Dr. Raveau.
This is season 1. Parenting Whole. The conversation all season long has been about parenting, showing up with our full humanity and inspiring the same in these souls that we're raising. Okay. This episode is all about the village, all the relationships that are a part of our parenting, a part of our families, and a part of who we are. This is, you guys, when I was prepping for today's episode, I was really feeling like there's a lot of places to go here.
Absolutely.
When we think about the village. I'm curious if either of you have maybe a couple of sentences about what you were thinking. This is what I really want to talk today about, to convo on today.
I think for me, it's helping people learn how to cultivate it if it's not something they have. And then feel maybe relieved and grateful for those that do have it.
I would totally second that. And I also think it'd be nice if there's more said about what it means to be a contributing energy to a village. And I don't mean like the doing, but just sometimes we forget how our presence alone brings value to other people's village or how they see their village. And so I would love to honor that too.
I agree with that. So let's begin, as we always do every episode. We're going to talk about the science on this topic. Then we will talk about the wisdom and then the practice. And you know what? The science on this topic is, honestly, it's a bit of a snooze fest, you guys.
Boring.
And I say that as somebody who, give me a real dense research article, and I will read then all the articles it cites. I love a research article. The research as a whole body on social support, it's kind of a bore because it's really, we're measuring social support in a pretty limited way. As researchers, we're really asking questions like, what adults are in your world that help you with the doing? Fill in the gaps. And so and the effects of how important social support is on mental wellness, on parenting, on children's outcomes, it's very robust over and over again. Yeah. We know that social support matters, and it matters. It's not it's not questioned, but it's a relatively small contributor based on just the research and how we're measuring it. And part of why I think that is, I'm trying to emphasize here, is that the way we're measuring it is in this kind of limited way. And what we're really doing is saying, when broken systems let you down, do you have people who help fill in the gaps? And at the end of the day, relying on our village to take the place of broken systems it's a burden. It can only be so effective. So that's what we're seeing in the research. It's somewhat effective, but it doesn't take the place of fixing problems. The other thing to learn from the science that I think is useful for today's conversation is that largely the ways that we measure social support on children's outcomes are indirect. Do their parents have social support? Does that then improve outcomes through parenting? Are parents able to be more responsive, attentive to their children? Are parents' mental health problems lessened so that they can raise healthy children? And the answer to that question is yes. Parent social support is the primary way we understand social support impacts children. But there have been some interesting research where we ask children directly about their own experiences with social support. And I want to say a couple of things about this that I think is useful. One is that there's a clear sort of takeaway that quality matters more than quantity. So it's not, do you have enough people, but do you have people in your life who you know for sure care about you and engage in the kind of helping behaviors that are actually helpful, who really support you. And children, I think, are really great at understanding meaningful relationships, actually.
Yeah, I have to say, this is a place where I'm incredibly proud of Afrocentrism.
Yes.
And Black psychology. I mean, in our quote unquote mainstream, or dare I say, like, whitewashed notions of what psychology is, yes, we've kind of, we have these like subspecialties, like how we referenced before, positive psychology. But when you look at Afrocentrism and you look at like, again, African anthropology, or you look at, music, I mean, everything is so communal. It's the staple. Everything's communal. It's not a subspecialty. It's not special. And in that way, like, it's not a unicorn. And I'm really proud of that. And I'm also very proud to have contributed it in some way. So the nonprofit that I founded many, many years ago, Future for Teens, one of the models that we published on is around our programmatic, integrated therapeutic concepts, all communal. It's all communal. There was a time where we had a basketball league, over 200 youth from different spaces and places, that were usually in conflict, the east side, the west side, the north side, the conflicts. And that's where we did what we have coined like dialectical behavioral skills, emotional regulation and distress tolerance and all that. But we did that in a very communal way. And that is what made it work, because everybody shared accountability for it. Everybody contributed to it. It was an anchor of pride. The village truly raises the child.
Yes.
And it's so paramount that it's almost something we forget or is looked at in a passive way.
And so I want to say here too, I'm so glad you raised this, because the other problem with the research, well, there's many problems, but another problem that this relates to is that part of what might be happening where we're not seeing these huge effects that we know are true from the lived experience is that we're conducting this measurement among groups of people who collectivism is the norm. Right. So we're not actually measuring, does social support matter? We're kind of asking, does more or less, right? We're comparing people within groups such that it's sort of a false takeaway, because this idea of more not necessarily being more doesn't get captured in our research. The other thing that you are sort of, I think, I'm inferring from what you said, that I want to name, is that the research on social support, again, it defines social support in this one way. And then I think the ways actually the village shows up in our lives get defined elsewhere in the research, right? That dialogue and collectivist orientations to problems, we're not capturing these. We're not talking with kids about how they experience the world and where they see relationships as part of the fabric of how people are role modeling wellness for them. This is not what we're talking about in the research. We're really strictly talking about this kind of transactional, behavioral kind of a thing. Does it matter? And so I that's why I say it's kind of a snooze, because I think it's kind of restrictive. But something science-y that I want to make reference to before we get into the wisdom, which I think is going to give us a lot more to talk about here. Many years ago, I did a study with children who had a parent in prison. And I sat with each child and interviewed them. And one of the measures, the questionnaires we used, asked children to name who are the 5 people. This is how the question was asked. Who are the 5 people who are most helpful to you? And then each person they had to rate on a scale. I can't believe I did this. Most helpful to least helpful, like a 1 to 5. And one of my favorite things from this survey I discovered is that children didn't typically, when they heard that word helpful, these are elementary school children, they weren't like the parent who is raising me or grandma who makes my lunch every day. Sometimes they did, but often they included on this sheet of their top 5 people a pet lizard, often the incarcerated parent, a friend at school. And it was clear to me that they were interpreting this question in a really kind of spiritual, psychic way. Who do I hold in mind? Who makes me feel loved even, I think, is how they were really thinking about social support. So it's really made me wonder about that a lot, too, along with them.
Well, the metric wasn't helpfulness in the way we conceptualize it.
Right.
And
It
you
wasn't
wouldn't have
behavioral.
known until,
And asking them, what does helpfulness mean to you? I do think there is a lot of research around how the people in your village closest to you, if they're not okay or how okay they are affects the mother in particular and how that affects children. We know that. We know that when father's mental health is not well, it does directly impact the mother's mental health, which then affects the children. So there is that we have the data on that, knowing that within the village, we impact each other rather strongly. And we kind of, become each other's containers.
That's a very, I'm sorry. That's a very profound and poignant knowing. Because how often have we been or had experiences in our professional world or our personal world where it's it kind of sounds and looks like this: my child is really struggling and I need you to help them. And we find more and more and more that one of the best ways to help them is to help you. And how that kind of by default,
which is why
helps.
most child psychologists, they always assess for parental mental health and the marital quality.
Yeah, this is a really good point. And I would flip it too and say that we know from the research that really positive, mentally well adults in the home are an important source of resilience for children. If one parent is suffering, that's an important source of resilience that is really measured differently than this idea of social support. And we know a lot about how important it is to have positive, warm relationships among adults so that the children's outcomes are positive, because children, when they love multiple people, they need those people to love one another in some way. The other thing that I think is interesting, maybe, that we can add here in the conversation about science, that I think is a relatively new phenomenon. It's not new, except that I would say new in the sense that I do feel like it hasn't hit the popular sphere. We talk about this concept in psychology of attachment. And attachment is the oldest and best researched scientific idea around what the parent-child relationship is. And so what it really describes is your own internal, what we call a representation about what healthy relationships should look like based on the relationship you have with your primary caregiver, which refers to often your mother, but the person who you most interacted with in early childhood. How reliable that person was, how warm and supportive that person was in a predictable, patterned way, helps you become a person who looks for healthy, positive relationships down the road. Now, what's a really interesting finding that I don't think we talk about enough is that we know that children demonstrate different attachment-related behaviors with different adults.
Yes.
Now, this has been a little hard to capture in research because the other interesting thing is because you seek relationships that look like your earliest relationships, it is very common for children to be around adults who are similarly oriented to them because that's how they found each other in the first place.
What you're trying to say is that the parents there's a higher chance they're engaging with the child kind of similarly, and that's why they were attracted to each other.
That's right, exactly. Our romantic relationships mirror those early relationships because we're looking for that familiarity in life. Now, we have had opportunities. It doesn't always happen.
Yeah.
And we've had opportunities to observe children in these different relationships. And they do behave differently in response to each parent's cues. This is important because what we can extrapolate from this is that the more examples you have in your life of loving and responsive caregivers, the more you're going to experience a diversity and how love can be given and received, the more flexibility you'll have in really being able to choose partners and cultivate relationships that fit you. And I think that's a really important finding, and it's a way I often think about the beauty of inviting people into my children's lives. And I think we're going to talk about this a little bit later on. Clients always ask about navigating those tough in-law relationships, kinship relationships. And this is a way I really think about holding the imperfection or the differences.
Yeah.
That different people are going to love my children in ways that aren't how I do it.
Yeah.
And as long as it's not toxic, there's a place for my children to learn how to be in different kinds of relationships.
I think a wisdom I've gained throughout the years of motherhood is that we all give our lights and our shadows. A therapist actually once said this to me as me and my ex were sharing our anxieties about grandparents and said, everybody in your child's life will give your children their lights and their shadows. And your job isn't to get in the way and protect the child, but to give them the tools to deal with that. Of course, we're not talking about unsafe behavior or traumatizing behavior. So I think that's important. And you also hear a lot of people they'll be able to identify in particular their grandmother or their grandfather as the person that was that really grounded, stable person for them. But that grandmother or that grandfather was unable to do that for their mother or father.
Right.
And that's a really common thing that we see is that when people were parents, they did not have the resources to be regulated and available for their kids. But as they grow and they gain wisdom and they gain stability, they're able to do that for their grandchildren. And that is a dynamic within families that can sometimes be healing, but sometimes be confusing and conflicting because some parents can feel like, how come you didn't give me that? You didn't offer me that. Or it can be, I'm so glad that you're in a place now where you can offer my children that, even though you couldn't give me that.
Well, and to receive it as a gift to me. Like that I am indirectly so, but I am reaping the benefits of your evolution. There's still something in it for me. Because it's also very possible that I'm where you were 20 or 40 years ago, where I don't have the devices to do what you couldn't do for me. I'm having a hard time. What a blessing and how great it is that I don't have to. Like that I can experience it or enjoy it as a result of your evolution.
I think it gives hope to people that we keep evolving and we keep growing.
True.
Well, and I think too, I really relate to what you just said actually as a child, really thinking about the fact that a set of my grandparents I deeply, deeply loved. And I know that they were highly flawed for other people, and I don't see them that way. But what I needed from them as a grandchild was really different than what a child needed from them.
Right.
And I think about that with my children now as a parent, that I give them a thing, right? So what the grandparents give them, it is less a question of like, now you're here, but just that there's space for this, right? And I'm part of making that space so that they don't need everything, right? It feels like we are really moving into the wisdom.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think I'm thinking about my own village, and you're talking to parents. Something that makes it feel really impactful and meaningful is when you feel like there is the enough people around you where you have shared values around. You care about the same things. Just thinking about your closest friends, maybe cousins, the neighbor, your siblings, or your parents, right? Do we generally think about raising children similarly? Do we generally value the same things in life? And I think when people feel like they are in those villages where my authentic self and my values also aligns with yours, you so frequently feel seen, and there's so much attunement. And that attunement, I think, is really pivotal when it comes to being able to, parent children.
Wow. I think what I'm holding is something that I don't quite fully understand just yet. But I'm aware that there are a lot of people in my village that I clearly do not have the same values with. And yet I know they love me. And I love them. And so it's okay. And that helps to settle some of my expectations around how they will show up for me or
How
my
do you
children.
define love?
I define it as very much, I'm thinking of the late, great Bell Hooks, all about love, and just that we're not talking about what she coins cathexis as far as like tender feelings. That's a feature of it, but that it's really like a commitment and a practice to seeing another person and extending oneself to them in the ways that serve them.
Yes.
Even if it's, it might not, even if it's not mine. And I think it's such a gift when you have access to that. It's it's an active thing.
So it's like, even if we don't see eye to eye on this topic, if you needed me, I will be there for you.
I can do that for you. And if I can't do that for you, I'll let you know I can't do that for you because I respect you enough to let you know. Yeah.
I also think something that you're naming, I don't want to say it for you because I know you said it was still in progress for you.
Yeah.
Something that it makes me think of, brings to mind for me, is that people live in such isolated ways today, and we've been forced into this to some degree because we've been told that the nuclear family should be the main family unit, except that this is a completely non-human way that we're living. It's purely for economic reasons, to create caste systems. It's a purely sociopolitical tool that we've created these spheres.
Yes.
So that's part of it. It's not that people are necessarily even just choosing it. But I also see people closing people out of their village. Out of kind of this distance in values or behaviors or sometimes imperfections that I don't want to minimize can feel very impactful. And we don't, because we're like, it's like a vicious circle where we don't learn how to really engage in conversation with one another. We don't know how to confront the problems. And so we just give up and we create isolation. But as we are increasingly sure that we need to shield our children from anything that is different, potentially negative, that it's our job to create a bubble around them, I think we're creating more and more walls with one another.
Right.
And I see this happening a lot in the Jewish community what I really see is that it's like this transition over the generations towards whiteness in this country, that Jewish people have always lived in mutual aid networks, village mentalities. My mom grew up in a household where aunts and uncles were living on the same street. And there's lots of great stories about how they were just all, someone came to pick someone up for a date and everyone's over and all the things. That's how we've always lived. And as we become more sort of allowed into white spaces, there's this drift away from community life for us.
Right.
And it just impacts people, I think, even at this very interpersonal level, that a lot of friends I have say that they feel alone.
Yeah.
And I think there is this persistent kind of loneliness, but if we're going to be not lonely, there's no perfect, We have to somehow be able to embrace the village around us.
Well, you're also like calling attention to how we name the village, because I'm for whatever reason I'm so connected in this moment to Lonnie Duncan, and he was my mentor, and he's passed on, but like I would say he's a part of my village. He's not like blood, and to your point, I mean, friends or play cousins. How many of you have play cousins? Like there's no, we don't know who's connected to who, but we're family.
Yeah.
People will ask me often how many siblings I have, and I always say 7 or 4. It kind of depends on where I am in that day. Biologically, I have 3. But I've got my god siblings, and then my mentees that have become my siblings, and so you're also speaking to how we name and validate what a village even looks like, and that the ancestral elements of the village, like they're still very present.
Yeah. So we're talking about the concept of the village, and our cultural wisdoms, I think, are all similar in the sense that we value the village. Shall we talk about how we navigate, maybe from cultural perspectives, maybe not? What is our wisdom to share on the tough relationships, on how, as you said, how can you cultivate a village if you don't have one? Even at a kind of fundamental level, I find myself talking to folks about making friends in adulthood. Making new connections.
I really want to hear from you, Hasti, but you're so nice, Dr. Erika, because I'm translating what you're saying in my head as like crazy old Uncle Jimmy, how you deal with his crazy, or how we talk, or people that just feel problematic in the village. Those are my people, but we don't really want them around or whatever. You're talking about the conflicts, because it's not all warm and fuzzy.
Yes.
And I don't know if everybody would agree with me in my wisdom, but for me, what works for me and what I wholeheartedly believe is that to be healthy and to be able to parent from a place of abundance, we need to have some level of people, and for somebody it might just be 1. For somebody else, it might be 5 who gets us and who understand us. And we feel like I don't have to monitor with you, right? You see the best in me, and we have a lot of trust, and we have a sense of security with each other.
Yeah.
So for me, that is my core closest girlfriends. And very lucky that also some cousins, I deeply have that with them. And so when it comes to things like talking about the challenges of motherhood, romantic relationships, body, pregnancy, sex, work, we don't filter, and we are very free. That sense of freedom, that you are not going to judge me and you will see me as me. So we're not enmeshed and we're not codependent, for me has been pivotal in regarding to growing as a person, growing as a mother, really figuring out how do I want to mother, how do I want to love myself. And that can be really hard if we've coming from a lot of intergenerational trauma and family systems where your authentic self and what you deeply believe in isn't maybe accepted and celebrated or understood. It can be really, really hard. And so when I'm working clinically, I work with a lot of people who are working with intergenerational trauma.
Yes.
I really encourage them to first get comfortable with who they authentically are and express it. I think something that happened for me when I immigrated to America is that I really closed off. I became very socially anxious and introverted and was really high on self-monitoring. And
I can understand why.
yeah, and I remember changing high schools in junior year, and this is back before social media. So even though I was moving from like one city to the next city, I wasn't worried that the kids in that city were going to know, right? I said to myself, Hasti, like, no one here is going to know you. You can go back to who you are. You don't have to be inside. You can be outside. And I remember having that conversation with myself because I think when I lived in Iran, I was really within my authentic self. And I stayed very committed to that. But when you engage with so many people, especially women, that's not how they feel. They feel like they have to really hide, and there's so much shame, and they have to do a lot of monitoring and really being careful about what they're going to say. And I'm sure my ADHD, helps because there's impulsivity around it. I think it and it comes out. But it has helped me bring people close to me who are my people. So when we're spending so much time monitoring and how are people wanting me to be, then you're getting in your own way of cultivating that authentic village for yourself.
The absent, I would wholeheartedly agree with that. That feels very true to me. And I think the absence of that is a part of what is showing up when we talk about the trauma and we hear things. I mean, I've heard things over and over again, like no new friends, the self-preservation of it all, as opposed to why not? More people to love and more people to love me and new lessons to learn. It's coming from a very fragile, non-existent reality, living in that, being able to live out loud and be embraced and being taught that I can't do that or that's not available to me or it's too risky for me and I will be harmed.
Yeah.
One of the biggest ahas I had not too long ago, a few years ago, is one of the kind of cultural, I don't even want to call it cultural, one of the trauma narratives in my mind growing up was that men will disappoint you. Men will disappoint you. And there are times, even now, but primarily before, where that would show up in my behavior in my marriage. And maybe even in my parenting, because I'm raising two boys that identify as boys. And so, but then I kind of settled into this well, everybody disappoints everybody. That's just human. Unintentionally, and that there's still love available to you. And I think sometimes we're so afraid. I've been very afraid at times of that we almost cut ourselves off at the knees, and we're very isolated.
But disappointment is such a gift because it's really helping you tune into your needs.
Sure.
And it's necessary. You need to experience it so you can get curious around what we need and how to communicate it.
Well, yeah, yesterday I found that out. Yeah.
Yes.
I think something I'm reflecting on a little bit, because I asked this question about conflict resolution, and then where the conversation really took us was about how we cultivate. And it really makes me think about something that's really true about all relationships, is that you can't escape the presence of conflict. That is part of relationships. And I don't know that there are perfect ways to either erase the potential for conflict or even sometimes to navigate it. Sometimes it's really about meeting it, knowing it, having the will to work through it. But what I do feel like I know more about, I understand better, I think, in a kind of intentional way, is how to cultivate. Oh, I'm sorry. I just apologize to the microphone, you guys. I don't know. Did it bang? Did you hear a noise? What I know is how to cultivate. I really have a very deep village, actually, a big village. And it's one of, for me, the greatest treasures I have in my life are all these people. And I really think about village behavior. We've sort of talked about, when we were talking about the science, we were like, well, how do we even really define this? Because the science is kind of doing a bad job. Is it about the actual behaviors? Is it about what you receive? Is that why social support matters? Or is it about the ways you hold in mind the love? Or is it something about having people who know and love you and kind of make you feel like you have the energy reserves to go into these, the most important relationships in our lives with our kids? Is that it? I think these are all parts of it. And I think then what I really think about is villaging, right, as a behavior, right?
Yeah.
How am I every day practicing a village mentality? How am I incorporating my kids into those practices? We have this joke in our family. There was a preschool teacher, actually a substitute preschool teacher, and a member of our congregation whom at the time, I think she was 4, really, she's 8 now, my daughter really bonded with. And she used to call her best friend grown up Shelley. And she would run into her arms when we would see her at temple. And one of the really beautiful things I think about spiritual communities is this intergenerational villaging, right? So we have this joke about best friend grown-ups. And there's a best friend grown-up who has said to my kids, if you're ever in so much trouble you're afraid to call your parents, I'm the one you call. And she says, I'll drive you to Canada, but once we're over the border, you're going to tell me what you did. And and you know, it's a joke, of course, but it's not. It's a person they know who is there for them in a different way than maybe I can always be there for them. And so I really notice and try to cultivate those relationships for them. And because it's like villaging, it's like then I'm really being thoughtful about how am I doing that for the children in my world.
Villaging requires vulnerability.
Yeah.
It can feel very risky. Like, you know, and we've talked quite a bit around the tool around fear and anxiety in our current culture, where everyone's very afraid of risks and what that's going to be to their children. I mean, you hear it all the time. I'm not letting nobody babysit my kids.
Yes.
I'm not letting anybody do this. And then even the way in which we kind of teach or support our children are anchored in this too. I did a speaking event quite some while ago, and we were talking about racial trauma, and in particular, we were also talking about sexual trauma and rape and violence and sexual rape and violence. And so much of what we're organized to do is to teach our children how to protect themselves and assume the responsibility of that. Like, you know, this is what bad touch is, and this is who you talk to, and this is what you do. I'm not against that. I've done some of that with my own children. But I was talking about, well, I think it's also, this is how to be a safe person for other people.
Yes.
Like, this is also how to be a comforting and safe person for others. And then how am I a safe person for people and others?
Yes.
Because it's so scary and vulnerable.
Yes.
Don't take my child to Canada. You know, I think that's some of what people are sitting with.
Right.
And
I think people forget that to be able to cultivate that village for yourself, at the core of it is you being committed to continuously growing your own relational skills.
Yes.
And I think people don't see it that way because they're always in the victim mentality. They always think the problem is somebody else, and they don't understand that it is an art to learn how to be as a human in relationships. And I love the phrase, grass is always green where you water it. And I love this analogy of the relational dance. And people have to make a commitment to keep growing as individuals in doing the dance, not so that the other person will do X, Y, or Z, but because it's the right thing to do as humans. And so having conversations with clients where they'll say to me, my partner just doesn't want to take any feedback. As soon as I give some feedback, they get all defensive. And I say, it sounds like you really value a relationship where there's openness and giving and receiving feedback. How are you modeling that? How often are you saying to your partner or your kids, hey, give me some feedback? How often are you welcoming it? How often are you staying non-reactive and not acting like there is danger coming your way? Right? So I think it starts with like us modeling what we want to receive.
Yes. Oh, yes.
And again, making it a lifelong commitment as a parent, as a human who cares about this, to keep, I'm going to always be a work in progress, and to be a mature, loving adult in all my relationships. I'm focusing on what I have control over.
I think we're really moving into the practice. I learned something today. I love what you just said, that cultivating relationships is very much about being the kind of friend, daughter, mother, wife, partner, husband that you are hoping to receive. I think that's something to really reflect on. I hope others are listening and can do that reflection. I think that is largely something I'm doing. It really speaks to me, and I think in many of my relationships, I'm thinking a lot about that. But not all of them, and not at all times.
Well, and this is why I think this is tricky. Like, we're talking about it, and yet I'm aware it's hard to execute in real time because it's not incredibly literal all the time either. You know, I bought my partner, this $500 thing for Valentine's Day, and they didn't buy me anything. And so they don't love me and they don't care for me. And, or I hear this quite a bit clinically, I'm giving and giving and giving, and I'm doing and doing and doing, and people don't do this for me. And it might be the way you're experiencing or seeing it, or maybe there's something else at play. So I think you're right. This piece of like, how am I showing up in a way that's communal and connected, that is a part of the village, but it's not always literal. It's like conceptual and philosophical and spiritual, and you get what I'm saying? I think we struggle in that way.
I do think, though, I think also this is a conversation about how every relationship has power. That is what a relationship is creating some kind of a balance and power, which is never equal. Power is a feature of relationships. And in relationships where I have more power to make impact, I do that. I role model the kind of relationship I want to have, and because I have power to impact the relationship, that is that creates the change. And then there are relationships where I have less power to make change. And so the more I give, maybe, because that is the kind of relationship I want to have. I love to care for people, and I need care. But in relationships where I have less power to create impact, then I end up feeling like a doormat.
Right.
And we don't want to promote that idea either, that you can impact all your relationships just through being. But then there's probably something here in living in general in a way that feels authentic to you, regardless of what the actual outcome is that you create. Because the more I live in a giving way, and the more I exist in relationships and spaces where there is no give back, actually, the less I'm connected to those people, the less energy over time I'm going to put in. There is a change.
I think a lot of it has to do with why we're giving. Sometimes we are giving so we cannot feel alone. Like if I give, you won't leave me.
Right.
Sometimes we give to receive. Sometimes we give because we are so anxious about how you're not okay. So I must give and give so you can be okay, because I can't be okay if you're not okay. So those are all ways of being that energetically drain us, right? And so I think that's a whole thing. But yesterday I was reading that many generations ago, people would make community village level decisions that would impact 7 generations. So when they were trying to make decisions for their village, they would think, how is this going to impact the next 7 generations? And a main issue here is that we're in a culture where people don't even care about themselves next year.
Right.
So we are talking
That's so
about,
true.
we're here today talking about how do you cultivate a village and the importance of it. But it requires a collective mindset shift for the entire society to start caring about the next generations to come. And so I say this because if some of the stuff we're talking about today feels so energetically exhausting for the listener, it is because you're living part of a community that is very narcissistic and materialistic and doesn't really care whether or what's happening in schools, what's happening to mothers when they're pregnant and postpartum, and what's happening to those who are vulnerable and in need. It's exhausting to kind of fight the battle on your own.
It is. And to push back and to still have the belief my kid will be fine. I think even just at like a practical level, I mean, you're talking about something, I don't want to race the level of collectivistic thinking that is missing from our world today, from those who have the most power and the loudest voices today, I should say. I want to name that, but I also want to talk about the day-to-day for parents, because we've been talking all season long about really finding your own heart song, knowing who you are as a way to be the best parent you can be. And what you just said really speaks to me, that something that I've tried to get really clear on with my husband, with my kids together, is I always say, what are we even doing here? What is it we're doing here? And it comes down to this for me, that the world we're living in, our peers, there's a lot of like racing around to sporting events and lessons for all kinds of things. And listen, we're doing it too. But I've always said, I know for sure, I'm not raising athletes. I'm not raising professional dancers. My kids do engage in these activities for joy, teamness, exercising their passions, facing challenges, meeting goals. There's so many wonderful things about these experiences. And yet these are just part of their childhoods. Who I know for sure they're going to be are Jewish, partners to somebody, friends, I hope parents one day. These are the things for sure. And so how is our actual time lining up with those lessons? How am I thinking about their future, and how am I thinking about their future as part of our community's future? This comes to mind for me. And so even just at a practical level, I want to name that we work really hard at family dinner.
Right.
Making that time happen, because that's the thing in their life I hope will persist.
I think it's also important from a practice standpoint is to remember that the child in front of you that you're raising is their own sovereign being. And so what kind of a village do they thrive in?
Yes. What influences
Does this human, the soul need?
that you can or can't give?
And that
right?
exactly. And that will overlap with what you need to some extent, but there might be a part that's separate.
I could see it being very threatening for some people to say, somebody else can give my child something. But I just want to say here
Yes.
that this has been extremely freeing for me
Yes.
to not have to be everything.
Yes.
To be able to name my own gaps with love, with embrace that is human.
Yeah.
And I think about this a lot because I think it's a privilege to have what I guess is a kind of confidence, but actually it's not. That's not how I think of it. I don't think of it as confidence. I actually think of it as the faith I have in my village. It's faith that everything my kids need, if I open my doors wider and wider, they'll have it.
I think something that a lot of people are hearing right now on social media or on the web is this idea of the inner child. And it made me think about it in relation to you saying parents feeling threatened. A lot of parents get threatened when they notice there's a bond happening between their child and somebody else. And it can feel like what if you love that person more? Right? And so then it causes parents to want to put the walls up because then I'm going to feel abandoned. And it does a lot of the topic we're talking about today around cultivating your village, getting connected to who you authentically are, celebrating your child for who they are. If you're finding yourself getting triggered, it is that child within, oftentimes, that is so scared of not being enough and not being wanted and not belonging. And it can get in our way of giving our kids what they need.
Yes.
So doing that work is so important.
I really don't have much to add here because I think when you asked the question earlier, that's a part of what I really feel has felt most significant to me is the shift from fear and threat and of other people's influence to more of like a gratitude, like you helping my child is helping me, and I appreciate you for caring enough to offer what you have to offer. And I think whether that's a pastor at church or a coach or a friend or somebody at Target that sees that my toddler's walking away and they're like, hey, don't do that, honey. Come over here.
Yes.
As opposed to don't touch my child. I appreciate that. And I understand why it's so scary in this culture to position ourselves in that way. It requires an exponential amount of faith. Exponential.
And not all gurus in our village for the child is coming with the light.
Right.
Some of the gurus in the village come with the dark. And again, it's important to not see that valuable. There is so much gift in the challenges in the child's life. Our job, again, is to get out of the way, let life unfold, and we just have to stand enough and teach the skills.
I don't know if this is what you mean by the darkness. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit. But I was just laughing to myself because I just texted a friend the other day and I said, I think I'm not raising my kids with enough of an edge. Do you think
they need a little more grit?
you think that they should be enough of they're not mean. Should they be a little mean?
I hear what you're trying to say. So I'll give an example. It's kind of like you have somebody in your village that you love dearly, and they are teaching their children, this is what girls do, and this is what boys do. And let's say they have some homophobic beliefs, right? And so you might be like, oh, like, now I'm not going to take my kids, I'm not going to expose, because that for our family values are bad. We're going to shield, right? And so, but I encourage people, again, to see they're also your teachers, your child's gurus. And your job is to, again, like, help your kid navigate these dynamics, because it can be really, we're getting really rigid around all this boundary stuff.
Yes.
To the point that
how
the
do I
walls-
exist in conflict?
Yes.
I need to know how to do that.
we dance?
How do I dance
through-
in conflict?
Yes, and yeah, not put the boundaries so high up, so that we are never having conversations and saying, you stay there with your beliefs, I'll stay here with my beliefs. I'm high and mighty because I'm doing my inner healing and I believe in these things, and I'm going to keep my kids around this side.
Okay, so our producer's telling us to wrap it up, and so I don't want to cut anyone off. I'm going to let's tie it up, and I want to just say one thing that is very practical I want to leave the audience with, because what you're alluding to, that I don't think people are mindful of, is orienting to your children as partners in who they become.
Thank you for saying that.
And if we can trust our children
Thank you for saying that.
to learn through the lens of the values we've given them, then what you're saying tracks, that they can meet a person like that and respond through the lens of values in ways that actually grows their integrity or their values-based way of being.
Yes.
And I think it's another conversation maybe for another time. How do you grow in your trust of who your child's becoming? But the practical recommendation I think I can make for today is spend some time observing your child. Keep a journal, however this works for you. Keep a journal, make voice notes, or just wonder to yourself. Be in a stance of curiosity about your child. How do you notice they engage with the world? When you're able to sit back and not say, what are they doing I have to save them from? But what can I also notice they're doing that is growing, that is becoming? And how do I hold that in mind then in the moments that feel more frightening, more difficult?
A very practical thing that I know I grew up experiencing and holding very dear, and that is showing up in my children as it relates to building community, is no matter where we are, we speak to the people around us. Hi, on the elevator.
Yes.
How's your day? You know, we smile. And in particular, with people of color or Black folks that we perceive to be as Black. That's it.
Tell the people listening what you're doing.
You can't see. You can't see me. It's so subtle. It's just a gesture of recognition. I see you here.
Yeah.
Especially if you're in a very
Yes.
homogeneous space, if you're in a very white space or a very othered space, I see you. That's it. Very, very quiet. And my children do it too.
Yes.
You know, they just nod. So practical.
Yes, I love that so much, and that's
much.
villaging.
That's villaging, yes.
Well, thank you all for being part of this convo
Yeah.
on the village and social support and where we went. I learned a lot today. I thank you both. And this is the end of season 1, Parenting Whole.
Yeah.
Thank you all for being part of the conversation. There will be more opportunities for us to talk, and we really want to hear from you. We're preparing what season 2 is going to be all about as the convo continues to heal. So if you have any wants, any conversations coming up in your life, please reach out to us, and it may show up in a future season. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
The Convo doesn't stop here. For links to the resources and research mentioned in today's episode, head on over to the show notes at convoheals.com/6. That's convoheals.com/6.